Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I wanted to start on my series where I'm going to kind of try to defend Ernest Hemingway, or at least discuss why I love or like Ernest Hemingway so much. So this was prompted in part by reactions to my declarations of liking lots of Hemingway's work and Hemingway as a writer. And it seems to me that Hemingway's fallen out of fashion somewhat at the university level and in terms of scholarship, and that his work isn't being read as much as it was before. And I think this is largely because he is seen as being kind of a macho man, misogynist, kind of the king of dude bro lit, I think is kind of the way Steve Donahue put it in a comment session we had kind of back and forth with one another. And I really think that that's a shame. I'm not saying that he wasn't a misogynist. I'm certainly not saying he was a great person. He certainly was troubled, and he was not always kind to other people, and certainly not to his wives. I'm not saying that his macho man persona didn't overtake what I think might have been his real personality and didn't negatively affect his writing. I think it did. But what I do believe is that Hemingway's work is important, that Hemingway's work had an impact, that Hemingway influenced generation after generation of writer, and that Hemingway still impacts the way we think about good writing and a lot of the things we associate with good writing. So today what I wanted to do was to make a video about Ernest Hemingway and my relationship with him, which I'm just going to call Papa and Me. So when I went to college, I really hadn't read very much. I read a lot of fantasy, I read some sci-fi when I was in college, despite the fact that my mother was an English teacher. For I guess maybe part of the reason I resisted reading more serious work was because of that. But I went to college without really having a broad knowledge of the classics of American literature. My best friend in college, the person who became my best friend in college, was the opposite. He was a reader from the moment I met him. He'd actually been a reader long before I met him. And he kind of helped inspire me to read more, and his favorite author in college was Hemingway. Once I'd read some Hemingway, I really became a part of, Papa's cult, and I became kind of really immersed in the ideas of Ernest Hemingway and his works. And I will fully and freely admit to having been a 100% Ernest Hemingway fanboy in the 1980s. So the first real book I read by Hemingway that had an impact on me was The Sun Also Rises. In lots of ways, The Sun Also Rises was the first real serious work of literary fiction that I ever read in my life, but I didn't love it for its serious literary fiction qualities. I didn't love it for the modernist style. I didn't even love it for Hemingway's brilliant use of dialogue. I loved it for the reasons I think Steve Donahue and others who suspect that Hemingway's popularity has to do with him being a dude bro. I loved it for dude bro reasons. I loved it for the wine, I loved it for the women, I loved it for the booze, the bullfights, the fishing, the travel. After reading The Sun Also Rises and learning a little bit more, I wanted to run with the bulls in Pamplona. I wanted to drink wine from a wineskin. I wanted to get drunk in foreign countries. I was completely hooked on that dude bro aspect of Hemingway's work. And in part for nostalgia reasons, I think The Sun Also Rises remains one of my favorite novels today. Having said that, I think I appreciate The Sun Also Rises and its strengths and weaknesses for much better reasons than the dude bro reasons. But the simple truth of the matter is that it was the dude bro appeal that brought me in. And maybe one reason why I'm less likely to condemn Hemingway for the dude bro thing is that I think without being introduced to Hemingway, without really getting involved and serious about reading and learning about Ernest Hemingway, that I never would have become the reader that I am today. He was kind of my entree into this kind of world of literary fiction. I really credit my interest in Hemingway for that. And so if it came for dude bro reasons, well, I'll just own up to the fact that I became a Hemingway fan for dude bro reasons. After reading The Sun Also Rises, I bought a collection of Hemingway's short stories, which I think combined several volumes of short stories by Hemingway. It was called The First 50, and it contained stories like Up in Michigan, and I think a story called Indian Summer, but most importantly to me, it contained the story, the two-part story, Big Two-Hearted River, which I will tell you is still, I think, probably my favorite short story ever written, and I'm planning on doing a whole video about Hemingway as a short story writer, and maybe just looking briefly at some of his best stories. It was this collection of short stories that made me want to write short stories, and so I started trying to write short stories in college, and in the process of doing that, I realized how difficult Hemingway's style was. In some ways, obviously, I was trying to emulate Hemingway either thematically or stylistically. It was really difficult to do. After reading the short stories, I think the next Hemingway book I read was A Moveable Feast, which of course is more or less a memoir of his time in Paris. And this is the book that really got me hooked. This is the book that made me, I think, like millions maybe of other men at various points in life, made me want to move to Paris, live in a garret style apartment, eat oysters and drink wine and sit at a cafe table and write. I was fully in. I wanted to be a writer. I loved the stories of his poverty. I love the story of him writing in cafes. I love the talks about the gossipy bits about other writers. I just love that whole lifestyle of a writer thing, which is as cliched as possible, and I fully admit to buying into all those cliches. So then, not surprisingly, I continued to read as much Hemingway as possible. I bought the collected stories of Hemingway and read almost all of them. I read the major novels of Hemingway, Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, his lesser works, which are on the whole flawed in lots of ways, Have and Have Not, Across the River and Into the Trees, and The Green Hills of Africa. I read those books along with The Old Man and the Sea in this just kind of huge gulp in which I just tried to read as much Hemingway and absorb as much as I possibly could. I read a couple of Hemingway biographies during this time period so I could learn more about the man and his life, and I just became kind of really immersed in Hemingway. Not surprisingly, after reading all of Hemingway, and particularly after reading Moveable Feast, I was curious to read other American writers from that time period. I read Fitzgerald, I read Faulkner, I went outside the United States, I read Joyce, and the more other writers I read, the more I think my devotion to Hemingway diminished. I became aware that there were other people doing other things, sometimes better than Hemingway, and sometimes in more creative and original ways than Hemingway. I became much more of a reader of other people's works. And then, having read, most of the Hemingway that he published during his lifestyle, I got involved in reading some of Hemingway's posthumous novels. So the first posthumous novel of Hemingway's I read was Islands in the Stream. This book was, the first part of this book, I think, was completed, if my memory serves. It was actually completed by Hemingway, and the rest of the part were kind of stuff where he'd written most of it, but he still had notes and he hadn't made his own corrections, and it really shows. The first part of Islands in the Stream is called Bimini, and it basically is about Hemingway's life in the Caribbean as a fisherman, and I really think that those first 200 pages of Island in the Stream contain some really great work by Ernest Hemingway. The rest of it definitely suffers, and I think you can almost feel the point at which Hemingway lost control of the story, and his editors and the people who posthumously put the book together. The second posthumous novel I read by Ernest Hemingway was The Garden of Eden. He'd actually begun this book, and the flap says, in 1946, but it wasn't published until 25 years after his death, and it is a mess of a novel. I'm not even actually sure anymore what exactly it was about, other than a relationship between a man and two women, or two women anyway, and a man. It's really confusing, and it's a mess, and in lots of ways it's far more experimental than I think we generally give Hemingway credit for. But having read this book, I decided, that's it for me and posthumous Hemingway. So I believe there have been two other Hemingway posthumous novels that have come out. One's called True at First Light, I believe, and there's a second one whose title I can't remember. And I just made the choice not to read those books. You know, if you were a Hemingway fan and you really liked his short stories, and you really liked Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea, which I think are his greatest novel-length works, then his posthumous works were disappointing, and I think they did more harm to his legacy than anything else. Posthumous novels of Hemingway kind of really didn't turn me against Hemingway, didn't make me dislike Hemingway, but they kind of broke that kind of fanboy spell that Hemingway held for me. So having decided not to read any more posthumous works published under Hemingway's name, I decided to go back and read a Hemingway title that I had avoided up till then, and that's Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon, which is essentially his book about bullfighting. And while there is some great Hemingway-style writing in this book, the subject of the book really, really disturbed me. Bullfighting, if you didn't know, is animal cruelty, and I can't see any way around it. I watched a bullfighting video on YouTube right after I read this book, and it's just gruesomely cruel and awful. And I can't imagine watching it for its entertainment value. I can certainly appreciate the skill and the bravery of the bullfighters themselves, but what they're doing is essentially killing a defenseless animal who's been, or mostly defenseless animal, who's been weakened and tortured over a long period of time to make it easier for the bullfighter to actually kill him. And that kind of cruelty is just not something that I can stomach. And Hemingway's love of bullfighting, his devotion to the sport, for lack of a better term or an easier term, really damaged in lots of ways how I thought about him. So that brings me to this section, which I'm just calling Papa and Me Today. So what I would say is that I deeply and unapologetically still love some of the work of Ernest Hemingway. I love The Sun Also Rises for all its flaws. I love some of his short stories. In the beginning, when I was a Hemingway fanboy, it was all great. Hemingway was great because the books were great and the stories were great. So Hemingway was great, and that's the way it went. And I couldn't separate those two things out. Having absorbed a lot and read a lot of Hemingway and then moved on to other writers, you know, that devotion was challenged by other writers who I may think are better or greater, and whose books may be superior to the books of Ernest Hemingway. And then, you know, I learned a lot about Hemingway the man, and Hemingway the man has serious flaws and serious character problems. But here's the thing, and this is kind of the point I want to make in this series of videos. You know, Hemingway's been dead, I think, since 1961. That's a long time. And nothing we do today is going to be able to go back and force Hemingway to be a better person. We can't reform his character. But just because his character was flawed doesn't mean that we should discard all of his works, and that we shouldn't still read them and appreciate them for their qualities and, you know, understand their flaws. His work deserves still to be recognized and studied, and him as a person, I think, is worthy of some level of compassion because his weaknesses and his allowance of his fame and and the caricature of himself that he helped create eventually destroyed him. It ruined his writing and it ruined his life. Anyway, this was the first, hopefully the first video in a series of videos about Hemingway I plan to make. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments section, and what you think about Hemingway, good or bad. And thanks for watching.